Welcome. Welcome to the third session of our Roadmap to Net Zero webinar series. Today, we're talking about cleaning our skies. So the world today is currently in the greatest race of all time to reach net zero before it's too late. And to prevent the worst effects of climate change, we must drastically cut emissions from sources like fossil fuels, forest destruction, and food production. But reduction alone is not enough. We must also remove pollution from the sky. The reality is that today, there's still unavoidable emissions. Take air travel. Only last week, the first ever commercial flight with 100% sustainable aviation fuels was taken by Virgin Atlantic. And even if sustainable aviation fuels was used today on all flights, it would only eliminate about 80% of emissions from aviation. So we're still many years away from making sustainable aviation fuels a viable solutions to cutting emissions. But even so, the future is not only about reducing emissions. We must also reduce the emissions that are in the sky today. Because the current CO2 that's already in the sky is also driving up temperatures. So even if we stop emitting all carbon emissions today, there's still a 42% chance that the Earth will surpass global warming thresholds within a decade, causing irreversible effects of climate change. So again, we cannot solely rely on emissions reductions. Climate scientists acknowledge that the net zero targets can only be achieved by drastically removing CO2 from the atmosphere. So this includes not only deploying nature-based carbon removal approaches like reforestation, but also newer carbon removal technologies. Sustainable Travel's international climate impact portfolio allows you to maximize your impact by spreading your climate contribution across various projects. Our portfolio already includes nature-based carbon removal projects such as reforestation and blue carbon, and now we're adding technology-based carbon removal to our portfolio. So I'm Paloma Zapata, CEO of Sustainable Travel International, and I'm joined by three inspirational women already leading innovative solutions, scrubbing CO2 from our air. So welcome Kelly Erhart, co-founder and president at Vesta. Priya Bular, co-founder and COO of Plan Boo. And Patricia Loria, VP of Business Development at CarbonCapture, Inc. So, experts, I would love for you to introduce yourselves and tell us what inspired you to work in clean carbon removal technology. Kelly, why don't you start today?
Thanks for having me, Paloma, and nice to meet you all virtually here. I'm Kelly and co-founder and president at Vesta, as Paloma mentioned. I've always been really passionate about the environment. I studied biology in university, and I started Vesta after spending my career working in climate and sustainability on various solutions and products that I felt could help humanity towards going towards what could be, a net positive to nature. And I see climate change as an issue that touches all social issues, poverty, food and water security, ecosystem health. And when I came to understand what Paloma just so very eloquently described, that we'd reached a point as a global society that we couldn't just reduce emissions anymore, but we in fact needed to remove large quantities of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere alongside emissions reductions, I knew that carbon dioxide removal was the most impactful place in the climate ecosystem that I could spend my time. So I've worked across various approaches for the last 7.5 years, technological and nature-based, and started Vesta back in 2019. We definitely have a long way to go on developing and scaling the technologies that can meet the, somewhere between 5 and 10 billion tons of carbon dioxide we need to remove from the atmosphere. But there are so many incredible solutions out there today. It's an incredibly exciting time to be a part of this industry.
Well, thank you. Thank you for doing what you do. Patricia, why don't you tell us a bit about your path?
Sure. So, I had spent my early career in business development at corporations. So I've worked at MasterCard, United Healthcare, and, those were amazing experiences, really smart people who, trained me in the basics of kind of marketing and business development. But after I had my second child, I really felt like I wanted to do more with my life and what was ways I could give back. And so I actually went and worked for a group called Mines Advisory Group that removes landmines and ordnance from countries recovering from conflict. And obviously also kind of a very rewarding path. But I remember the day that I was sitting at a refugee conference. Refugees are very associated with those types of cleanups that need to happen after war. And someone really made an offhanded comment that said, the refugees we see from war is nothing compared to what we're going to see from refugees from climate change. And that really just blew my mind, given if we think of everything that's happened, in the Middle East and watching that, unfold, that's just a small portion of what we're going to see 10 years or 20 years from now in terms of how communities are being impacted by climate change. So I wanted to get involved. I went back to school and got a master's in natural resources and ended up working for the Global Carbon Capture and Storage Institute that both focuses on carbon capture off of point source emissions to meet that reduction pathway, but also direct air capture, pulling CO2 out of the air and using kind of shared resources around transportation and sequestration across both of those pathways. And so I did that for about 5 years and then had the opportunity to come as kind of employee number 6, I think, at CarbonCapture Inc., a direct air capture company out of LA. And it's been a crazy, wonderful opportunity. And I will echo what Kelly says. I mean, what we're all doing is really hard. And so I, applaud anyone who's in this space. There's a lot of heartache that kind of goes with doing these first of a kind projects. And, you're confronted every day with kind of the challenges and, reading headlines about how the fact that we really have surpassed, 1.5 degrees global warming. And there's really no hope in staying below that number without at least some overshoot and bringing it back down. So yeah, it's a hard place, but glad to be amongst this group of women who are kind of fighting for the future.
Amazing. There's always that one moment, that like changed your life. So that's a really inspiring story. Thank you. Priya, what's your path?
I'm Priya. I am the COO and co-founder of Plan Boo. Well, back in 2015, I took a master's, which was pretty pivotal in just opening my eyes to the realities of what was happening in the world. That was at UCL in the UK. And I studied environment and sustainable development. And that set me on a path of understanding that the environment and its people are the same. So in a way that if you're affecting the global warming, then the people who live there are also affected in disproportionate ways. And that's put me on a path of understanding that it's socio-environmental climate change that we really need to be thinking about. So prior to finding Plan Boo, I worked for a number of different NGOs and development organizations, looking at kind of humanitarian disasters, the earthquake response in Kathmandu in Nepal. I was invited to Sierra Leone after a landslide there in 2017 to respond to shifting climatic conditions and the effect that it has on communities there. So that's really been at the core of what I believe in. However, I found the bureaucracy and the pace of change in some of these organizations really challenging and super frustrating. And what dawned on me that still rings true today is that we don't have enough time for a lot of these decisions and negotiations. It was around then which I met my co-founder, Freddie, whilst I was out in Sri Lanka on a surf trip. No better way to come up with ideas for a startup in climate change than being out in the ocean. And it was then we realized that we could actually do things hopefully quicker and meaningfully. So that's where we are today, and looking forward to this discussion.
Amazing. That's also a very inspiring story. Before we start getting into the topics, my colleague is going to display a small little poll for you to answer. We just want to understand, what is your understanding of these type of carbon removal projects, and if you're interested in funding these projects. So if you can just take a couple of seconds and just to answer this quick poll, and then we're going to jump right in to have a lively discussion and to really get into these particular projects that our speakers today are working on, so that you can fully understand, what it means. What is climate technology? What is, or call it, carbon removal climate technology? Interesting. There's already a question as what is Vesta, but we're getting into that. We're going to get right into that. Okay. All right. Are we going to display it? Here we go. Okay. So, wow, there's a lot of people that have already, supported nature-based solutions and reforestation. And there may be not so many that are supporting these emerging technologies. So there's really an opportunity here. This is what we're here for, to educate on what this is about, and to get you to really also support these type of projects, but because they are the future. Great. So what is carbon removal technology? How does it work? And what is the difference between carbon removal and carbon reduction, and how essential is carbon removal for what I was just talking about, this race towards, net zero goals, let's start this conversation. So, yeah, please, Priya, can you tell us a little bit about, what do you believe, what is carbon removal technology?
Sure. Thanks, Paloma. I'm happy to kick off and then
Yeah,
Patricia chime in. But so carbon removal technology is essentially the name for a suite of solutions that we've come up with, which range from nature-based, technological, with the principal aim of drawing CO2 emissions from the atmosphere and storing them out of the air for as long as possible. Whereas reduction is aiming to prevent new emissions going into the air through the use of fossil fuels, and carbon removal is about taking away historical ones. And this is super important. You touched on it in the intro, Paloma, but even if we now, with all of the emissions that we're putting out, we would still have too many in the atmosphere. So it's a really critical pathway now to reaching net zero. In fact, it's been deemed as essentially unavoidable now by the IPCC. So we're going to need to continue to remove carbon removal at much higher quantities if we are to stay within 1.5.
absolutely.
There's some criticism within carbon removal, which maybe we can get into a bit more later, but critics say that essentially without regulation within the space, carbon removal can be seen as a bit of a get out of jail free card, right? That you don't have to actually then reduce what you're putting out, you can just continue to remove, and there's no incentivization to decarbonize. And I'm sure we all agree here that carbon removals is never a green light for fossil business as usual. In fact, everything that we're working towards needs to inspire further climate efforts, essentially. The reality is that we need both removals and reductions to get to net zero.
Absolutely. Kelly, Patricia, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, totally agree with everything you just shared, Priya. And on the last statement, for sure, I think that the idea around the moral hazard of carbon dioxide removal is a complex one. And I think if you think about the issue for long enough, you realize that it's actually quite a moral hazard to not do carbon removal, given the scientific fact of where we are with emissions in our atmosphere today. And with appropriate regulation, we can be sure that doing carbon dioxide removal at scale is not a blank check for continual and continued emissions, but is instead a way to clean up the mess that we've made in the atmosphere and ensure that our planet is healthy and we have balanced ecosystems. I think because we're going to spend some time talking about a range of approaches, both technological and nature-based and hybrid, it's worthwhile, since a lot of the folks who are here today have supported reforestation and sort of nature-based solutions type projects, to outline, I think, a fundamental part of how our planet removes carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, which is that there are sort of two main cycles. There's the fast carbon cycle, or the short-term carbon cycle, which is the carbon cycle that's responsible for the types of credits that you've purchased if you've purchased afforestation credits. So it is a small part, actually, of the Earth's overall carbon balancing act, where trees and plants grow as they absorb carbon dioxide, and then they die and they re-release a large portion of the carbon dioxide. Some of it goes into the soil, but for the most part, it's re-released. And then the slow carbon cycle, or the long-term carbon cycle, is actually what regulates most carbon levels on Earth. It's the cycle that's responsible for moving carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and slowly back into rocks. So it generally happens as rocks weather, as volcanic activity. So volcanic activity forces carbon into the atmosphere, and then that carbon moves through a series of chemical processes that basically transforms the carbon into different forms of carbon until it's eventually rock again. So there's a lot of different ways that folks are trying to harness that process through mineralization of rock by using direct air capture technology and remineralizing rock with concentrated carbon. And then things that are more in the enhanced rock weathering space, which we do an iteration of with the power of the ocean. But I always like bringing into frame the difference between these two different carbon cycles, because as humans, we have this sort of short-term terrestrial bias where we like to think most about the things that we can see and touch and feel. And so trees and and sort of agriculture are things that are maybe a little bit more intuitive, but are actually responsible for much less of the carbon removal that our planet does for us.
Absolutely, for sure. Yes. And again, we still need to decarbonize. That's really the first thing. And we also need to remove, from the air. So reduction and removal definitely is the path. But maybe now we can get, right into, some of these amazing technologies that all of you are working on. So Patricia, you're working on direct air capture, which, you guys have in a very ambitious plan, an initiative to create, the largest facility in the world. Can you tell us a bit more about, what is direct air capture? I think, Kelly started, mentioning it, but tell us a bit more. How does that work? And, what are the different byproducts and potential byproducts and exactly what carbon capture is doing?
Great. Thank you so much, Paloma. Yes, so direct air capture is a technology-based solution. So essentially, we are in the process of building plants, and that's, like factories that will take CO2 out of the air. And we use a process called temperature vacuum swing absorption, where essentially there are amine-based solutions that exist that essentially bind to CO2. So as air goes over these solutions, again, the chemicals essentially attract that CO2 and bind it. And then what we do is heat those back up to a relatively high temperature, like 90 degrees Celsius, that will release the CO2 where we can capture it and transport it for either storage or use. And we are looking at multiple use cases. So CO2 into concrete, CO2 into sustainable aviation fuel, or geological sequestration, which essentially is, as Kelly described, kind of the mineralization over years of that. As relates to turning CO2 into rock, that mineralization and storage underground, this has been heavily studied by many governments, including the United States government, the Department of Energy. They've probably spent over the last 20 years, and again, it has been a long period of research that's gone into geological sequestration, over $200 million looking at how do we do this safely, securely, make sure that it's not affecting kind of water levels, make sure that there's no seismic activity that's affected as a result of it. So I would say it is a very proven technology. Certainly direct air capture in and of itself, we announced Project Bison, which is a project out of Wyoming where we intend to sequester 5 million tons a year in the geology in that state, which has some of the best geology in the world for sequestering CO2. These are big infrastructure projects, so we need energy, we need water, and so we essentially need a place to put the CO2. So there's a lot that kind of goes into them, but we're getting certainly a lot of support from the U.S. federal government, states, and early buyers to make this happen.
Absolutely. That's very exciting project that you guys are building on, and a very needed project, of course, but there's some challenges there, and we're going to talk about those challenges on scaling project. But biochar. So what is biochar and what's unique about PlanBoo's approach? Can you tell us a bit about that, Priya?
Absolutely. Yeah. So biochar looks like charcoal, has some slight differences. It's made through a process called pyrolysis, which is essentially taking plant biomass and cooking it under certain conditions so that you are storing CO2 in a solid, durable form. This is an ancient agricultural practice. Biochar was found in Amazonian soils dated back to 3,000 years ago. So in that aspect, it's not new. However, more recently, it's kind of come to the fore as a proven carbon removal solution and as a way to extract carbon from the atmosphere and generate certified carbon removal credits. So that's where we come in as a solution. We provide the technology to connect farmers to the carbon market. And we've got tools and we provide the technology and the training, which allows farmers to essentially take plant biomass in the form of waste, either agricultural crop waste or any other plant waste that they're not using, and turn it into biochar. And we focus on MRV. MRV is the measuring, the reporting, and the verification. This is really key. It's essentially the cornerstone of quality and integrity within carbon removal projects. So to ensure that integrity of carbon removal is taking place, we're able to track with our solution service called Mervin, so Measure, Report, Verification, Intelligence Network. And this tracks that biochar is taking place where and when the projects say it is happening, and we're able to track performance, thereby improving the efficacy of carbon removal. The view with this is to bring trust and transparency back to carbon markets, which a lot of people have become disillusioned with after criticisms, and rightly so, of credits that were not seen to be of good standard. So everything we're doing now is to build back trust into carbon markets.
Absolutely. Very, very important. And now, what is ocean carbon removal? And, this fascinating, Vesta project, Vesta approach. Kelly, can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah. So the ocean is our largest active carbon reservoir. So the ocean is bested only by rocks, which actually hold about 99.9% of carbon on Earth. But the ocean is the largest active one that carbon's moving in and out of. So we live on a planet that's more than 70% ocean. And again, the terrestrial bias is an interesting one. So the ocean can remove carbon in many ways, biologically, but also chemically. So that is the process that we work with. So I was talking about the long-term carbon cycle in my introduction to carbon removal. And essentially what we're doing is speeding up the carbon removal part of the Earth's natural long-term carbon cycle. So we take a natural and globally abundant mineral called olivine. Olivine is an alkaline rock. It's a volcanic mineral, and we grind it into a sand. We make the sand a size that can be compatible with coastal protection projects. So our work is addressing sort of two things. One is carbon dioxide removal, but also adding sand to coastal protection projects to help communities that are experiencing sea level rise and erosion to give them additional material to basically prevent and slow wave action and erosion. So we add this sand to coastal protection projects, and every grain of sand in the ocean is slowly dissolving. But when olivine sand dissolves, because it's alkaline, as it dissolves, it generates new alkalinity in the ocean in the form of dissolved bicarbonate. And that essentially gives the ocean more space to sequester and store carbon dioxide. So the ocean has absorbed about 30% of our carbon emissions since the Industrial Revolution, but it's largely done so by absorbing them as carbonic acid, which is making our oceans more acidic and making it much harder for marine life to do what they need to do and build their skeletons and shells that are largely calcium carbonate based. So what we do is, basically help the ocean what it does best by increasing alkalinity in the ocean, reducing acidity, and helping to protect coastal communities. So when we remove carbon in this form, it's then stored permanently in seawater for 100,000 years or more. And the sort of literature around that is very well understood. It's a chemical reaction that kind of happens all the time. And we're just speeding up that millions of year process to be something that can happen instead over the course of years or decades.
Fascinating. I love it that we have, you're working with ocean, you're working with soil, and you're working with air. There's like so many mediums, that we can work in, to really accelerate, the Earth's ability and our ability to remove, carbon dioxide from the air. So a lot of these technologies, like all three of you mentioned, they already exist. There's all of these already existing technologies. But we still have challenges. We have challenges to scale these type of projects, fast enough. So let's talk a little bit about what those what those challenges are. How can we scale these technologies? What are, and then of course in the transparency and the visibility as well, so that we can all feel confident. Those that, are not experts in this space, like all of you, like you guys are, living day to day, how can we add more transparency into this space? And of course, the role of carbon offsets to help scale this project, these type of projects. So yeah, can one of you jump in?
Maybe I can kick off just with the challenges and leave the others to pick up the rest. But there are a number of different challenges. I'll speak to just a few which I'm seeing on my end. And I mean, firstly, it's around the time that it takes to actually build these solutions, and to build them to scale to the billions of tons that we need every single year by 2050. It needs to happen fast. However, this urgency for removals doesn't seem to have caught up. And lots of people don't really understand that you need to invest today to be able to have a sufficient supply for the future when it's really going to come into demand. So for us, that's why it's really important that we work in tropical regions. It's areas where, because of abundant sunlight and correct climatic conditions, that plants can grow the fastest on land terrestrially and can absorb as much CO2 as possible. So biochar has a capacity to remove 2.6 billion tons per year, every year, in globally, and 70% of that can happen in tropical regions. So number one, I'd say, is the challenges around time and urgency. The second one is around regulation. We touched on it before about carbon removals cannot denote that business as usual can take place. But there are people that are afraid that vested interests and industries like oil and gas are going to simply use it as an excuse to keep burning fossil fuels. So I think within our international forums, like the UN framework for Convention of Climate Change and at COP, which is taking place now, we need to be bringing carbon removals into the discussion. There are changes that are happening at the EU level. There is the carbon removal certification framework, which is in negotiation. However, we've got a long way to go before it becomes legislation. So yeah, carbon removal also needs to take the fore in the same way that we kind of prioritize decarbonization. And thirdly is just around cost. Carbon removal is really expensive. And to create the economies of scale that we need, we need investment. So how do we create economic incentives to invest in carbon removal today? And what are the mechanisms that are going to align with that? I think a big part of it is pricing on carbon. But even solutions like biochar that is ready to scale today because it doesn't require big hardware and infrastructure, it still requires investment. The space we're in MRV, really we need globally cost-effective and reliable standardized MRV, and that's going to cost some money. So we really need that investment into the space.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, even in decarbonization, we do need regulations. We need the enabling environment to be there and the investment. Kelly, Patricia, you want to add more to that?
I can jump in. And first, we talk a lot about transparency in the carbon dioxide removal markets, right? I mean, we want to ensure that if we're saying a ton is coming out of the air and being, durably stored, that that's actually happening. And there has been some mistrust in the offset market because of projects that either, misrepresented how much CO2 they were removing or kind of double sold that. So we are, as an industry, working kind of against some of that kind of bad reputation. And so, I think it's incredibly important, all the work that each of these companies is doing, to be incredibly transparent about what they're doing. And for us, I would say it might be a little bit simpler. So that's not as much of a challenge for direct air capture because there are flow meters. I know exactly how much CO2 I'm taking out of the air. I know exactly how much CO2 is underground. I know exactly if any CO2 is being leaked because there are kind of flow monitors everywhere. But, we also have our challenges, and that is, one thing we need is a lot of clean energy to do that. And the world isn't keeping up with how much clean energy it needs. So, people ask, from a policy perspective, what do we look at? In the United States, we look at things like permitting reform that can help more clean energy get onto the grid. There's a lot of solar and project developers who just can't, bring in their energy into the grid because of, issues around around, grid reliability and, old grids. So that's certainly something that's incredibly important, not only for reductions, but for technical carbon removal. As I said, we do require some water. It could be brackish water. So in Wyoming, we're actually looking at drilling for that water. So not taking essentially kind of drinking water or water that could be used for grazing, but more kind of industrial grade water. But there are probably some places in the world where direct air capture is just not going to be feasible because of that kind of water demand. So I would say, just there are certainly a lot of challenges to scaling this, bringing down costs. I will kind of throw in one additional thing. I talked about those chemicals that we use, and that's going to be a lot of where our cost reduction comes down. We do consider ourselves like a material science company and are working with leading labs all over the world and kind of companies to do that innovation. So, I would say I'm a technology optimist, right? I think that, if there is demand signals, we can see a lot of innovation, not only in kind of manufacturing of these units, but in the material science space, and certainly bring the cost down for direct air capture.
Absolutely, yeah. Even in renewable energies, which were, back to 30 years ago, it wasn't feasible. We needed a lot of investment, and nowadays we're at that point. Even though you're saying that we need more, of course, but like we are definitely advancing. So I think carbon removals just need that, that incentive, the financial structure to support the investment for sure.
Yeah.
So
I'll just jump in with a little extra on the challenges on our side that we see, definitely echoing a lot of what the other panelists said, and to underscore the point on investment. There is so much money that needs to flow into carbon dioxide removal project deployment, and the way that we finance that is, demand and market signals that support investment. And so I think that the market itself for the voluntary carbon market has grown a lot in the last number of years. But we have a way to go. And so sort of working with suppliers that are high quality and putting offtakes and agreements in place that can allow project developers to go and finance their projects is really critical to ensure that financing flows to the right places. And then the other thing on, I think on MRV, measurement, reporting, and verification, that's worth pointing out, is that, as Patricia was saying, their process is fairly simple. She has a flow meter. She can see the carbon, going in and out. And that's true with some technological systems, but that's not true when we're working in the natural environment. And so people call the natural environment an open system, where there are definitely things that you can measure that are correlated with carbon removal. But at the end of the day, you can't put a dome over the ocean. You can't put a dome over a farm. You can't put a dome over a forest and see how much carbon is going in and out. And so you have to work with the best available science and always be working towards more and more rigorous estimates of carbon removal based on our knowledge of these open systems and how they interact. So many open systems and natural systems, they use, direct measurements of things that can be measured, and then models for things that can't be measured. And I think that in things like forestry, we've seen a lot of criticism there, and that is in part due to the technology, though that's really advanced in many ways, but it's mainly due to the human manipulation, the manipulation of baselines that don't allow us to understand actually how much work is being done at a project site. And I think that the one big thing that we do need as an industry is up-leveling of the rigor of our registries and the methodologies that are approved, and how continual baselining is done when we are working in natural systems. I think that if our registries and the sort of entities that are verifying projects are trusted, then we can see the carbon market grow in the way that we need it to. And if we can't get to that trusted place where there is transparency and verifiability across the chain, then this market is not going to be able to grow. So just definitely agree with all the points that were raised there.
Absolutely. Very, very well said. Carbon offsetting is only 30 years. It's only been around for 30 years, and the methodologies continue to evolve, and the technology, like you just mentioned, just continues to evolve. So there are, these mechanisms and experts that are continuously working in this space, and we really need to really continue to support that and request and ask more for that rigorous and for the transparency. But besides the very important effect of removing carbon from the air. These carbon removal projects are also supporting many other environmental, economic, and social benefits, especially projects that are sustainable and that are holistic. So I want to hear more about what you guys are doing as far as, so for example, Project Vesta's climate justice approach, working with local communities, and also your approach reduces coastal erosion and ocean acidification. So there's some social benefits as well as environmental benefits, besides, you know, the very important, again, a act of removing carbon from the air.
Yeah, so as you mentioned, there's some other environmental and social benefits, coastal erosion and reduction in acidity. But I think that talking specifically about our engagement program and our social science program, so Vesta, we do a lot of science. We are the first organization in the world to ever deploy a field pilot of this type. And so we like to joke that we operate a small oceanographic institute. We have 11 PhDs on staff full-time and have been doing research across the hard sciences and the sort of soft sciences, if you will. But community engagement and social science is a really big part of our program because number one, we recognize that the ocean is a public good. And number two, we recognize that coastal communities are truly experiencing climate change, in some cases first and worst in different parts of the world with sea level rise. And so we actually think there's an outsized opportunity to ensure that these communities can benefit from the work that we're doing in more ways than one. So we operated a lab in the Dominican Republic for a number of years, and we worked closely with that community and some local social scientists to develop a framework for participatory governance and engagement to co-design give back programs to ensure that that community was supported through the work that we were doing. And then we published a few papers on that research, trying to understand perceptions around carbon dioxide removal in the global South. And that informed the framework that we are now iterating on at different sites, first in the United States, and then, you know, we'll sort of scale globally from here. And in the United States, that process of community engagement is quite different. It is much more about community education sessions, local internship programs, ensuring that the community is sort of with us every step along the way, from permit application to, you know, the completion of our research program there. And we're also doing a sort of reflective study of what we did in the Dominican Republic now in North Carolina, where we're planning to deploy our second pilot site next year, where we're taking sort of a global North perspective to understand underserved communities in the global North and their perceptions around carbon dioxide removal. So we'll be publishing that reflective study as well, all coming from this frame of really, if we can understand how communities feel, that's the first step towards ensuring that everyone is being engaged with equitably and being given back to in appropriate ways.
Amazing. And Plan Boo support farmers across the tropics to boost agricultural production, but there's also a lot of other co-benefits of biochar. Can you tell us a little bit about, you know, what Plan Boo is doing to support these local farmers, and if there are any risks, how you're mitigating those risks?
Sure, yeah, it's biochar is incredibly healing for soil. So it's a proven solution to actually remediate some of the most degraded soils in the world. It does that through a number of different ways, but just some of them is that it increases the surface area of soil, so thereby it's able to store and hold on to water for longer, increasing the options to hold on to microbial content and all the good stuff that soils need, as well as balancing out the pH of the soil itself. So it's really amazing to support then increased crop yields, which we hope then also impacts and economically for the livelihoods of the farmers and the communities that we work with. For us, the main incentive then is the revenue share from the carbon removal credit retail, which we're also working with. So we sell the credits and we share the revenue back with the landowner from 80-20, 80% going to the landowners themselves. So there are some environmental and social hazards for sure, and there's something that we have to continually keep on top of because it's ever evolving, right? New things come out. But as it is, one of them is that biochar, as we mentioned at the start, is like charcoal. So if you were to apply that directly to the soil, it's flammable in the same way that charcoal is. At the same time, if biochar is put too heavily directly onto the soil, there are, in some examples, cases whereby it then actually absorbs the nutrients that would otherwise have been there available for the plant. So we don't want that to happen. That's the reverse. So to mitigate this, we apply or encourage that all the landowners and projects we work with actually mix the biochar with a type of locally available compost. This can be from chicken manure to other mulch and other things that are available. What this does is reduce the flammability, of course, but also means that, it stays into the soil for longer. It doesn't take away from the plants that are already there. In fact, it gives more, and otherwise means that we're avoiding, another important point I wanted to add was that we're avoiding community sourcing biomass by deforesting areas. There are examples where in order to, cook as fuel and timber, you cut down local forests. So to avoid that, Plan B only works with projects that can prove out that they're using a waste source of biomass. That can be from your waste agricultural crop. It can be a weed or something else that is otherwise wasteful.
Amazing. Yeah, and so that's avoiding more emissions. And I was also thinking about avoiding so the increased dependency that, these tropical nations have on imported goods as well as you increase yields. So, especially in the tourism industry, it's something that, we also need to really understand that it really relies on local production, and we need to support local production. And these type of projects also support that. And so, Patricia, you guys are, Wyoming, where you're building, your biggest and your largest facility, is embracing carbon removals, and they really want to become a carbon negative state. So that's really amazing. So, can you tell us a little bit about, your community reach out programs and how you're working with the local communities as well? Oh, you're on mute.
Yeah, sorry about that. So, even before we kind of announced the project, we thought it was really important to make sure that the community wanted this project. So, we went in probably a good 6 months before we decided this would be our location and talked to community leaders, talked to mayors, community engagement or community development councils. And so our project has always been really closely aligned with the community, and we've done several town halls where we've talked to the community about what our opportunities are. Wyoming is a state that is a big energy exporter, and a lot of that energy comes from coal-fired fossil fuel power plants. And so there's a long pathway for them to kind of fully decarbonize the state and figure out what the future of the state looks like in a zero carbon world. And certainly, as I would think with many places in the world, the younger generations really feel that, I would say, more than, the older generations in terms of how important that is, both to their economic future and to the planet. So I would say, we try to be really cognizant of how scary that can be for people, that their way of life could change, that industries that have supported their families for generations could go away. And, in their mind, the oil and gas industry is what's created their schools. It's what's created, their rec centers, et cetera. And so there certainly is kind of a lot of fear there of the future. And so, what we do is try to work with them to show there's an alternative there. Like, there are new jobs that will be coming from these new technologies. And, through a partnership with the Department of Energy, who I think takes this very seriously as well in terms of how are we helping communities to move forward. As part of our direct air capture hub grant in Wyoming, we have over $2 million to spend with the community. And some of that, probably $1 million of that, is going to go to building new training programs at community colleges to help these people prepare for the jobs of the future, and also kind of educate them on the importance of these technologies. But it's also working with the communities just to say, look, if we're going to build this here, you're probably going to need, more people doing certain jobs. And so how do we ensure that we're kind of helping you get to that point, whether it be, through infrastructure development, like roads and schools, et cetera. So there's essentially money that's allocated for us to negotiate with each community. What are the things they really need most as they look at the economic transition? And another thing that's really important in Wyoming is conservation. This is a state with wide open, beautiful spaces, large mammal migratory corridors. And so we have a good amount of money kind of set aside for projects related to that as well, and particularly a project related to repatriating bison, right? Off after the name Project Bison. So, I certainly think there's a way to do these projects differently than what's been done in the past. And certainly, we again are going to commend the Department of Energy for how they're thinking about structuring these programs and providing funds for benefits that really go into the community as well.
Well, so much to learn from all the projects that you're doing. So I want to make sure that we give enough time for Q&A. So we have a few questions that we would like to address. So open questions. Okay. So this is for you, Priya, the first one. I'm curious if you have response to potential criticisms that biochar takes away plant biomass that could be used as compost fertilizer. Or as a non-expert, that's the first thing that comes to my mind. If you can, explain that a little bit more. I think you touched upon it before, but yeah, if you can explain that a bit more.
Yeah, sure. I mean, so there are 7 billion tons of plant waste, of plant biomass that's produced every single year, from plantations, from across the agricultural sector. So we've got a lot of plant biomass that is available that is just sitting there. It's usually burnt and just thereby re-releasing the CO2 back into the atmosphere. So this is the key part here, which we touched on, which is working with waste streams, right? Which otherwise don't have a use. So it's actually then allowing the community to use something that was otherwise wasteful into something of value. So yeah, I would say we have no shortage of plant biomass available. And then, coupled with that, we combine it with compost and fertilizers. So it's actually, that's the golden combination there, is to, even in some cases, so that we don't sort of go cold turkey with soils that have otherwise been really holding on to chemical fertilizers like NPK for decades. What we are seeing is biochar mixed with some reduced levels of chemical fertilizer, in fact, helps soils to wean off being addicted to strong modern chemical fertilizers. So yeah, that combination there between either organic, bio-based compost or chemical fertilizers mixed with biochar is the way to go.
Amazing. Second question, Kelly, where is olivine derived from, and how long does it take to dissolve? That's really fascinating. I like the idea that they're both absorbing CO2 and also helping with coastal issues like ocean acidity.
Yeah, so olivine is found on every continent. It makes up over 50% of the Earth's upper mantle. So it's a very abundant global mineral. It is extracted more in certain parts of the world where there, are sort of better reserves. But here in the United States, there's extraction of olivine in Washington State and actually also in North Carolina. We have sourced our olivine from our supply chain partner in Norway for our first project, and we'll be doing so for our second project as well. But as we scale the technology, we'll be sourcing more proximate to the location where we deploy. So that's sort of one of the big benefits to this approach, is that olivine is abundant, and doing coastal carbon capture relies on the supply chains that already exist to mine, grind, and transport bulk materials. So these supply chains are very efficient, and at scale, it means that they're incredibly cost effective. So we can do very large scale carbon removal at very low cost. So our goal is to be able to provide 1 billion tons of carbon removal annually, and do so at a cost that's far below $100 per ton. And then I guess the other part of the question was, how long does it take to dissolve? So that depends on the coastal area that the olivine is dissolving in. So there are a number of conditions that make the process more efficient, so the carbon removal can happen faster. These are things like wave wave energy, water temperature, pH, salinity, and a big part of our technology platform for measuring carbon dioxide removal also integrates project design and how we design projects to be the most efficient and ecologically beneficial as possible. So that's another sort of thing that we optimize as we scale. But generally, it takes years or decades in some cases to dissolve fully. But one little geeky thing about olivine as well is that it dissolves over a half-life curve, which is to say that you get the majority of the carbon removal in the first half of the project's lifetime. And then there's sort of a decaying tail of slower carbon removal.
And so what is that best combination between the waves and the temperature, or is there?
Yeah, it's warmer water and higher wave energy. Yeah.
Okay, so the tropics probably.
The tropics, some parts of the Middle East. Yeah.
Fascinating. And so this question is for Patricia. How does the benefit of direct air capture outweigh its energy consumption? I think you were touching upon that as well. Considering the energy crisis in Europe last year, do you think that we will further increase energy demand and price?
So yeah, we're never going to kind of shy away from this question. It is a big question related to direct air capture. We need a lot of energy. As I've said, we have the capacity to build a lot more traditional renewable energy, whether it be solar or wind, that can support, I would say, direct air capture through the next, decade or so. But really, to get to the scale we need, there's just not enough land for that kind of wind or solar. But there's a lot of innovation going on in energy systems, both small modular nuclear, geothermal. So, I really believe that the future of DAC is, co-located alternative energy sources with direct air capture. And so, that innovation will allow much smaller footprints. Also things like nuclear and geothermal have that heat that is needed for, direct air capture processes as well, so that you're not converting electricity to heat, which is what you have to do with, more traditional renewables. So there's going to be a lot of innovation there that I think enables that. But certainly it's one of those challenges that if we can't improve technology in both of those spaces, then it's going to be really hard to meet all of our kind of goals. I will, I mentioned it briefly in kind of some of my opening remarks, but certainly want to kind of give a shout out for sustainable aviation fuel as well, derived from direct air capture CO2. There's plenty of players and great recent announcements from folks like Infinium and 12 and Dimensional and Air Company, who are doing some really, to me, fascinating things around creating drop-in aviation fuel made out of waste CO2 and catalysts through kind of Fischer-Tropsch and other processes. So, direct air capture isn't just about kind of getting rid of legacy emissions. It's also can be transformative for some of these hard to abate sectors.
That is really fascinating. The possibility of using that for sustainable aviation fuels for sure. So I'm going to take one last question because I want to make sure that, let's see how we do. But this next question is for Priya. I wonder if there is any regulation in biochar feedstock origin and traceability. If there's no traceability of feedstock origin, would there be a chance of feedstocks linked to deforestation being used mixed in biochar production?
Yeah, it's a great question. There absolutely is a risk of that, right? And as we touched on before, without having the regulation in place, there's no understanding, even on a bio side of the carbon removal credit, that we know where and when the biochar is being made and from what. So that is key and integral into the Mervyn solution that we have. The MRV, so the Measuring, Reporting, Verification Intelligence Network that we've built at Planboo, whereby it's absolutely fundamental that the feedstock is traceable right back to source. And then we have strict criteria, which means otherwise a project wouldn't be feasible. We wouldn't be able to take it through into activation stage, whereby it has to be proven with either permits and certifications that you're able to move and clear said biomass, or otherwise it was already used or considered as a waste. So that, however, is not a framework that has been taken at any kind of international level yet. as we're saying, there needs much more in the way of MRV within some of the EU certification framework negotiations that are taking place. But as it stands, there isn't kind of a set framework, but hopefully with a push from the likes of Plan B, we can kind of get more and more people trying to set that standard.
Absolutely. Yeah, and this is exactly what you guys are trying to do, which is create that traceability. So that's, it's fascinating for sure. So I don't want to go beyond, the top of the hour. So I'm going to start, concluding. It's been to me, very informative and inspiring. We in the tourism sector, we know that sustainability is not so much anymore nice to have, but is an imperative. And of course, building climate-friendly products is really important. Decarbonizing the sector is, absolutely really important. But equally important is for businesses to also support, our ability to be able to remove carbon dioxide from the air, so that we can all, meet our net zero goals. It really is going to take a village. It's going to take all of us to do something about this. And again, I want to commend the speakers today for actually taking action. You guys are very inspiring, and your solutions and what you're doing is inspiring. We still have a long way to go to be able to scale these type of projects, to make sure that we do that effectively and that we do it on time and we do it with minimizing, any environmental risks that there could be. And of course, again, increasing circularity, which is what you guys are doing as well, really supporting, environmental conditions, to supporting, local communities, which is, really important, again, for this entire transition that we're in. Before breaking, we're going to put also a link. My colleague's going to put a link in the chat, so that if you want to learn more about how to take climate action, how to support, our carbon portfolio, which all of these amazing projects that you just heard from, they're going to be supported through our portfolio, so you can all contribute to what these amazing women are working on. And we also want to put a little small poll, because it's very important for us to know and understand what you guys want to learn more about this space, about the roadmap to net zero. So if you take a minute or a couple of seconds to tell us what you want to hear in our next webinar session, and then we will be happy to curate that. Again, thank you so much for listening in. Thank the speakers for your time, for your valuable contribution to the race towards net zero, and very much looking forward to continue working with all three of you and supporting your projects, and really helping you scale these amazing projects, and telling the story, and educating and generating awareness with our viewers, with our partners in this space. So if there are any, we have 2 minutes, and if there are any parting words from our speakers, as far as, if you have like one thing that, our viewers can do to start taking climate action, what's that one thing that you recommend for them to do?
I mean, I guess I would throw out buy some carbon removal credits, right? You can do that via Paloma. We also, you can go to our website and buy our carbon removal credits directly. I think that demonstrates to our investors and to banks that things are changing, even small buyers. When we look at the number of kind of small buyers that also are coming on, it's demonstrating, demand in the future. And so, some people I think, oh, I could only spend $25 a month or something. What's the point of getting involved in some of these higher cost projects? It does matter. I think individual contributions, we know, add up, to add up to big things. And so be active and put some money against it.
Absolutely. Just coming to the webinar, it's a first step. Trying to, learn about these type of projects and the importance of these type of projects. So that's already a really big step. And, any other parting words, Kelly, Priya?
I agree. Buy carbon removal. Find portfolios of high quality solutions that you want to support, and vote with your dollar, and show the industry that you work in what you think is important to prioritize.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I totally agree with both what Kelly and Patricia are saying. and also just to be active in the purchases that we make as well. You know, be conscious with the types of investments that we make, put our money there as well, but also get involved with projects. There are so many opportunities to transition into green jobs, but also within your own sectors and industries that put pressure on your sustainability leads to do things differently and keep speaking up. And if it's not good enough, then protest it. So this is the only way now. It's not the time to just be polite and sit down. And I think now's the time to push harder than ever.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for your time, for your valuable contributions. And again, thank you everybody for joining us. And you can definitely see this webinar online, and you can contact us if you want to learn more. Bye.